They ask me sometimes why I never went back to the sea after what happened to the Essex. I tell them my legs grew too old and my eyes too weak to read the stars anymore. But that is a lie I have whispered so many times that it has become comfortable like old cloth. The truth is something else entirely, something that lives in the spaces between my heartbeats even now. It begins in the autumn of 1820 when I was 14 years old and desperate for escape. My father had died that summer, leaving nothing behind but debts and a name that meant nothing in Nantucket. The whaling ships were always hungry for young bodies willing to work for almost nothing and ask no questions. I walked down to the harbor that gray October morning with everything I owned wrapped in a single cloth bundle. The Essex sat there in the fog like a ghost ship, waiting for souls brave or foolish enough to board. She was not large by whaling standards, but to my young eyes she seemed like a floating wooden cathedral. Captain George Pollard watched the new recruits shuffle aboard with the cold eyes of a man who measured souls daily. I climbed that gangplank on trembling legs, though I told myself it was only the morning chill, nothing more. First Mate Owen Chase grabbed my shoulder and looked at me the way a butcher examines questionable meat. He asked if I had ever killed anything larger than a chicken, and I lied and said yes many times. Chase laughed and told me the ocean has a way of teaching young men the weight of their own words. They assigned me to work in the cabin as the lowest crew member, barely above the rats in the hold. 20 men would call this ship home for 2 years, hunting the great whales across the vast Pacific waters. I did not know then that fewer than half of us would ever see Nantucket shores again in this lifetime. The morning we set sail, the sky hung low and gray like a wool blanket pressed upon the sleeping harbor. I stood at the stern watching my hometown grow smaller until it was nothing but a smudge on the horizon. That was the moment I understood there was no turning back, and the boy I had been was already dying. The first 3 days passed in a blur of seasickness and humiliation as my body rejected everything the ocean offered. I vomited until there was nothing left inside me, and then I vomited some more, just bile and shame. The older sailors laughed and said every man pays his toll before the sea decides whether to keep him. By the 4th morning, something changed as I woke before dawn and felt the ship moving beneath me like breath. The nausea had passed, and in its place grew something unexpected, a hunger to prove myself worthy of this world. That was the day Chase called all hands to deck with a voice that cut through the morning fog. He pointed toward the horizon where sea met sky and spoke 2 words that changed everything I thought I understood. There she blows. My heart stopped as I followed his finger toward a distant spray of white against the gray Atlantic waters. A whale had surfaced perhaps a mile away, exhaling mist that caught the early light like a ghostly fountain. The deck erupted into controlled chaos as men transformed into a single-purpose hunting machine made of bone and flesh. 3 whaleboats were lowered into the churning water, each carrying 6 men armed with harpoons, lances, and coiled rope. I was assigned to Chase's boat as the most expendable member, the one who would learn by watching or dying. We rowed in silence toward the beast, our oars cutting the dark water in perfect rhythm like a great heartbeat. As we drew closer, I saw the whale clearly for the first time, and my breath abandoned me completely. It was enormous beyond anything I had imagined, a living mountain of gray flesh that dwarfed our tiny boat entirely. The creature was 60 feet long, with a head like a battering ram, and an eye that seemed ancient beyond measuring. That eye found me across the water, and I swear upon my soul, it looked directly into my very being. I was not a hunter approaching prey, but a small, frightened animal being examined by something far older and wiser. Chase raised his harpoon, and I watched the muscles in his arm tense like cables preparing to release terrible energy. The whale began to dive, and Chase screamed for us to row harder before the beast escaped into the darkness below. We surged forward, and Chase threw the iron with all his strength, and I heard the wet thud as it struck. The whale screamed. I did not know until that moment that whales could scream, but that sound was almost human in its agony. The rope attached to the harpoon flew out of the boat so fast that it smoked against the wooden edge. We were attached now to a wounded god, dragging us across the ocean surface like a toy behind a running child. The Nantucket sleigh ride, they called it, and I gripped the gunwale as spray and terror soaked me completely. For 20 minutes, that wounded giant pulled us through waves that crashed over the bow, threatening to swamp us entirely. Men shouted orders I could not hear over the roaring water and my own blood pounding inside my skull. Then suddenly the whale stopped, and the silence that followed was worse because silence at sea means something is coming. The creature surfaced 30 feet away and turned its massive head to look at us with that ancient, terrible eye. Blood poured from the wound where the harpoon had buried itself, and the water around us turned red like spilled wine. Chase grabbed a steel lance and stood at the bow, ready to deliver the killing blow to this dying giant. But the whale moved first. It rolled its enormous body and brought its tail down upon the water, creating a wave that lifted our boat. We capsized in an instant, and suddenly I was underwater in the cold, dark Atlantic with no sense of direction. I kicked and thrashed, and my lungs burned, and the world became nothing but pressure and cold and approaching death. Something brushed against my leg in the darkness, and I knew with horrible clarity it was the whale beneath me. My hand found the surface, and I gasped for air as hands grabbed my collar and pulled me onto the hull. 6 men clung to that wooden shell in red water, watching the whale circle us like a cat with wounded mice. I was certain the creature would finish what it had started and drag us all down into the silent depths. But the whale did something I could not understand even now, after all these years of turning it in my mind. It stopped circling and held still in the water, and that ancient eye found mine across the red-stained distance. We looked at each other, the dying whale and the terrified boy, and something passed between us I cannot name. Then slowly, almost gently, the great creature sank beneath the surface and disappeared into darkness, taking the harpoon with it. We floated there for an hour before the Essex found us cold and shaking and forever changed by what we witnessed. No one spoke of what happened officially, because a whale that escapes means no oil, no money, no justification at all. But I saw how the other men looked at me differently after that, as if I carried some invisible mark now. Owen Chase told me that night that some men are touched by the sea and others are merely tolerated by it. He said I should pay attention to which one I was, because the ocean always collects its debts eventually. I did not understand what he meant then, but I would learn when the Essex met its fate 8 months later. That first whale, the one that looked into my eyes and chose to let us live, I think about it still. I wonder sometimes if it knew what was coming for us, and if that look was a warning I missed. The sea takes what it wants when it wants, and there is nothing any man can do but try to survive. That is the first lesson the ocean taught me on my very first hunt, and I have never forgotten it. Some nights I still see that eye in my dreams, ancient and knowing and full of something like sorrow. The boy who climbed aboard the Essex that October morning died somewhere in that red water beneath an empty sky. The man who climbed back aboard was someone else entirely, someone who understood that hunter and hunted are the same. That is what the sea does to those who dare venture upon her waters, seeking fortune or glory or escape. She breaks you down into pieces, and if you survive, she builds you back into something harder and colder entirely. I was 14 years old when I learned that lesson, and I carry it with me still even now. The candle flickers and the shadows dance upon the walls, and somewhere out there the ocean waits patient and hungry. She is always hungry, and she never forgets.